Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take a stack of information and extract the most important nuggets, giving you a shortcut to being well-informed. Today we're plunging into a topic that has captivated and horrified generations, exploring the life and crimes of one of America's most infamous serial killers, Ted Bundy.
It is a complex and deeply disturbing subject, definitely. And our mission today is really to sift through the available sources to understand not just what happened, but how. How did Bundy manage to evade capture for so long?
Right.
And the chilling evolution of his methodology and, the lasting questions surrounding his pathology. It's a challenging deep dive for sure, but one that offers, I think, profound insights into the nature of deceptive evil and just the frightening reality of a predator who, well, blended seamlessly into society.
Yeah, you might think you know the story of Ted Bundy, maybe from documentaries or headlines you've seen over the years, but what we'll unpack today reveals layers of manipulation, hidden pasts, and a chilling adaptability. It allowed him to operate with this almost chameleon-like ability, appearing utterly normal, even charming, while committing just unspeakable acts. We have extensive sources for this deep dive, biographical accounts from people who knew him, detailed police and FBI reports, even his own confessions and psychological evaluations later on.
And we'll be focusing on the factual content, presenting the information as impartially as we can, highlighting the specific details and the patterns that emerge from all these different materials. This isn't about sensationalism, definitely not. It's about gaining a thorough understanding of a truly disturbing chapter in criminal history and maybe what it teaches us about perception, deception, and, well, the hidden depths of human cruelty. So let's explore this.
Okay, so to understand the man, we really need to start right at the very beginning. And in Bundy's case, his birth itself was just shrouded in secrets. Born Theodore Robert Cowell, November 24th, 1946, in Burlington, Vermont. His earliest days really laid a foundation built on a deliberate deception.
That's absolutely right. His biological father's identity was never actually confirmed, and his mother, Eleanor Louise Cowell, she initially had him raised by her parents, Samuel and Eleanor Cowell.
So his grandparents.
Exactly. To the outside world, and for much of his early life, Ted believed his grandparents were his parents and Louise was his older sister. This was a desperate, deliberate attempt to avoid the intense social stigma of, out-of-wedlock childbirth back in the 1940s.
A very different time.
Oh, absolutely. A time when that whole ideal nuclear family idea was so deeply ingrained in American society. The judgment associated with being, outside of that ideal was incredibly severe. So this was really a way to maintain appearances at all costs.
So his entire foundational understanding of his family, his very identity, was basically constructed on a lie. What did he say about his grandparents, the people he thought were his parents? Did he ever talk about finding out the truth, and what impact did that have on him?
Well, like so much with Bundy, he gave conflicting accounts about when and how he discovered the truth. He told one girlfriend a cousin called him a bastard and showed him his birth certificate.
Wow.
Yeah, but then he told biographers he found it himself. Anne Rule, the writer who actually knew him, she believed he discovered it later, maybe around 1969.
Okay.
But regardless of how he learned, he reportedly harbored this lifelong resentment toward his mother for not telling him directly. This secret, this fundamental lie, it might have profoundly shaped his later patterns of deception. If his own family could construct such an elaborate facade, what might that teach a young, impressionable mind about the malleability of truth and appearance?
That makes sense.
Yeah.
And his childhood wasn't just about this family secret, was it? I mean, we're talking about some truly disturbing early behaviors that, looking back now, paint a really chilling picture.
Indeed. And again, conflicting stories. While he spoke warmly of his grandparents in some interviews, even saying he identified with and clung to his grandfather, Samuel, later accounts from 1987 given by Bundy and other family members to attorneys, they dramatically contradict this. They describe Samuel as this tyrannical bully, prone to violent rages, beating his wife and the dog, swinging neighborhood cats by their tails.
Oh, my God.
Yeah, and expressing really racist and xenophobic views. There was even a report of him throwing Bundy's aunt, Julia, down the stairs just for oversleeping.
Jeez.
And Samuel would also apparently speak aloud to unseen presences and reportedly just flew into violent rages whenever Bundy's paternity was mentioned. Bundy described his grandmother as this timid, obedient woman who periodically underwent electroconvulsive therapy for depression and was actually afraid to leave their house.
That's a huge, jarring contradiction in his own narrative, isn't it? So we have this really conflicting, maybe abusive family background, and then the move to Washington State and even more disturbing signs.
Precisely. His mother, Louise, she moved to Tacoma, Washington in 1950, changing her surname to Nelson. Later, she married Johnny Culpepper Bundy, who adopted Ted. But Ted reportedly remained pretty distant from Johnny, complaining he was not his real father and wasn't very bright and didn't make much money, which really highlights his sort of nascent class anxieties and disdain even then.
Right.
And from a very early age, these disturbing patterns emerged. His Aunt Julia recalled waking up from a nap once to find herself surrounded by kitchen knives.
Wow.
With a 3-year-old Bunny just standing there smiling. It's just a snapshot of a truly unsettling moment.
I'll say.
And a childhood neighbor, Sandy Holt, described him as a mean-spirited kid who liked to inflict pain and suffering and fear. She claimed he engaged in horrific animal cruelty, like hanging a stray cat and setting it on fire.
It's awful.
Even more chillingly, she reported he would take younger children into the woods, force them to strip, and just terrorize them, to the point where she said you'd hear them screaming for blocks. There were even reports of these makeshift punji traps, sharp stakes hidden in the ground in his Tacoma neighborhood, which injured at least one young girl.
So the cruelty was there early.
It seems so, but it raises that important question, right? How much of this was a foundation for later behaviors, and how much was maybe retrospective interpretation after his crimes came to light? It's that classic chicken or egg scenario you get when analyzing the early lives of serial killers.
So despite these profoundly troubling indicators, how did he present himself socially during these formative years? Did he fit in at all, or was he like an obvious outsider?
Well, again, his accounts varied widely, which really points to his unreliable self-narration. He claimed he chose to be alone as an adolescent, that he couldn't understand interpersonal relationships, and had no natural sense of how to develop friendships. He famously said, "I didn't know what made people want to be friends," describing himself as shy and introverted.
But that wasn't the whole picture.
Not according to others. Classmates from Woodrow Wilson High School told Ann Rule that he was actually well-known and well-liked, kind of a medium-sized fish in a large pond. So this early divergence between his maybe inner turmoil and his outward social presentation is a really key insight into his later terrifying facade.
It suggests he learned deception early.
Exactly, an ability to project an image that contradicted his internal reality. And during high school, despite this clean-cut image, he was arrested at least twice for burglary and motor vehicle theft. Yeah, though the records were expunged, which was customary in Washington state for juvenile offenses back then. He also told Stephen Michaud, one of his biographers, that he'd canvass the community at night, looking into undraped windows, engaging in voyeurism.
Keeping Tom behavior.
Right. And psychologist Al Carlisle suggested he started fantasizing about women he saw while window peeping. This looks like a crucial early indicator of his later escalation, a gradual building up from just observation to this disturbing fascination with control and violation.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. Connecting those early behaviors and the development of that deceptive facade to the beginning of his known crimes. After high school, Bundy's university years seemed like a really crucial turning point, especially one particular relationship. What happened there?
Yeah, this period is absolutely pivotal. In 1967, while he was at the University of Washington studying Chinese, interestingly, he became romantically involved with a classmate, Diane Edwards. He later called her the only woman I ever really loved, referring to her as his dream girl, the woman he was completely dedicated to.
But it didn't last.
No. Edwards ended the relationship in early 1968. She was frustrated by his, quote, immaturity and lack of ambition, particularly his perceived lack of social standing and financial prospects. Psychiatrist Dorothy Otnow Lewis pinpointed this as probably the pivotal time in his development, marking a significant crisis for Bundy.
So that rejection hit hard.
It seems so, especially because it touched upon those anxieties about his social class, about not being good enough. It likely fueled a really deep resentment and a desire for control he felt he lacked.
So he's rejected, he's heartbroken. What happens next? How does he rebound? Because this seems like where his chameleon ability truly kicks into high gear.
Well, what's truly astonishing is how he seemed to transform himself. He was devastated, dropped out of college, traveled around, apparently immersing himself in violent pornographic literature while nursing his wounds. Ann Rule also believed it was around this time he discovered his true parentage back in Vermont, which would have added another layer to his internal turmoil. But he returns to Washington in late 1969, and he seems completely transformed. He's focused, goal-oriented, re-enrolls at UW, this time as a psychology major, becomes an honor student.
Wow, quite a turnaround.
It really is. He also took a job at Seattle's Suicide Hotline Crisis Center. And this is where he worked alongside Anne Rule, the future true crime writer, who described him then as kind, solicitous, and empathetic.
Chilling.
It demonstrates his incredible ability to present this completely normal, even charming facade to the world. He was, in effect, performing the role of the respectable, middle-class young man that Diane Edwards had found lacking in him before.
And he got involved in politics too, right?
Yeah, he worked on Governor Daniel J. Evans's re-election campaign, later got appointed to the Seattle Crime Prevention Advisory Committee. People described him as smart, aggressive, and a believer in the system. He even managed to get into law schools based on recommendations from high-profile figures, despite having pretty mediocre LSAT scores. This period truly highlights his mastery of public performance.
And yet, beneath this polished exterior, something was clearly festering, especially regarding Diane Edwards. It wasn't just about moving on, was it? There was more to it.
No, it was far more insidious than just moving on. In the summer of 1973, while he was doing work for the Republican Party, he deliberately rekindled his relationship with Edwards.
After all that time.
Yep. She was apparently amazed by his transformation into this serious professional. They even discussed marriage. At one point, he introduced her to a friend, Ross Davis, as his fiancé.
But he was seeing someone else.
Exactly. What's fascinating here is that he was simultaneously dating Elizabeth Klopfer, a single mother he'd met back in 1969. Neither woman knew the other existed, a testament to his complex web of deception.
Okay, so what happened with Edwards then?
In January 1974, Bundy abruptly broke off all contact with Edwards, just ghosted her completely. When she finally managed to reach him on the phone, he calmly stated, "Diane, I have no idea what you mean," and just hung up, utterly. His later explanation for this was chilling. "I just wanted to prove to myself that I could have married her." Edwards concluded it was deliberately planned, pure revenge for her earlier rejection. He gained this sort of narcissistic victory by being the one to finally reject her, taking back the control he felt she'd stripped from him years earlier.
And this act of calculated cruelty, it happened right before.
Right before the documented violence began.
So it was right around this time, January 1974, that young women began to disappear in the Pacific Northwest. So what was the first clear sign of his escalating violence, that bridge from emotional manipulation to physical assault and murder?
Well, while there's no definitive consensus on exactly when he started killing, his earliest documented homicide attempts began very shortly after he ended things with Edwards. On January 4, 1974, Karen Sparks, an 18-year-old UW student, was bludgeoned with a metal rod and sexually assaulted with it in her Seattle basement apartment. She survived, miraculously, but was left with permanent brain damage and significant loss of vision and hearing. Many people might think this attack came out of the blue, but one psychologist suggests this was an attack he'd built up to, a chilling escalation from his previous voyeurism and those fantasies of control.
And then came the first confirmed murder.
Just a month later, February 1st, Linda Ann Healy, a 21-year-old UW undergraduate, was beaten unconscious and carried away from her basement room. Bundy later confessed to raping and murdering her. Her mandible was recovered a year later on Taylor Mountain. Some sources emphasize that he saw her as privileged and undeserving, feeding into his underlying jealousy and shame, maybe mirroring his resentment toward Edwards. This marked his transition from rapist to killer. He crossed a Rubicon into the most horrific acts.
So the shift has happened. He's moved from attack to murder, and then the disappearances just exploded across Washington and Oregon. This is where he truly became a predator, operating with horrifying audacity.
That's absolutely right. During the first half of 1974, female college students disappeared at this alarming rate, about one per month. These victims included Donna Gail Manson, 19, from Evergreen State College on March 12th, Susan Elaine Rancourt, 18, Central Washington State College, April 17th, Roberta Kathleen Parks, 22, Oregon State University, May 6th, and Brenda Carol Ball, 22, from the Flame Tavern on June 1st.
And a pattern emerged quickly.
A chilling pattern, yes. They were all young, attractive white college students, often with long, middle-parted hair, strikingly similar to Diane Edwards.
Right.
Bundy's confession regarding Manson was particularly disturbing. He claimed he burned her skull in his girlfriend's fireplace.
In his girlfriend's fireplace?
Yes, down to the last ash, he said, in a fit of paranoia and cleanliness. It hints at his meticulous, chilling post-mortem rituals and desperate attempts to destroy evidence, demonstrating this pathological need for control even over remains.
And the way he approached them, the cast, the sling.
Exactly. Witnesses at various abduction scenes reported a man wearing a sling or a cast asking for help carrying books or loading a sailboat onto his car and driving a brown or tan Volkswagen Beetle. This became his evolving modus operandi, using charm and this feigned injury to lure victims, preying on their empathy.
Because he looked harmless.
He looked good-looking, charming, respectable. He disarmed anyone who met him. His weapon of choice was typically a blunt object, often a crowbar, to bludgeon his victims into unconsciousness, followed by strangulation-silent techniques that avoided noisy firearms and ballistic evidence.
It sounds incredibly brazen, especially the daylight abductions. Was there a specific incident that really heightened the alarm and maybe started to connect some of these cases for police?
The disappearance of Jorgen Hawkins, an 18-year-old UW student, on June 11th was particularly alarming even for law enforcement at the time. She vanished from a brightly lit alley between her boyfriend's dorm and her sorority house, a seemingly safe, well-trafficked area.
Right in the middle of campus.
Exactly. Bundy later told Detective Robert Keppel that he lured her, knocked her unconscious with a crowbar, and spent the entire night with her body out in Issaquah, a suburb east of Seattle.
Okay, but then?
Then, the next afternoon, in a feat so brazen it astonishes police even today, Bundy returned to the alley where a major crime scene investigation was underway.
No way.
Yes. And he retrieved Hawkins' earrings and a shoe he had left behind, completely unobserved. He even revisited her corpse 3 times later. This shows his evolving need for possession beyond the initial killing, extending to the physical remains and the scene of the crime itself.
And the irony.
The irony is grotesque. During this very period, Bundy was working as assistant director of the Seattle Crime Prevention Advisory Committee, where he actually wrote a pamphlet on rape prevention.
That's just unbelievable. So police were getting tips, but they weren't connecting the dots across states or even within their own jurisdiction yet, were they? What was the biggest barrier?
Exactly. Reports of attacks and missing women were appearing prominently in newspapers and on television. Fear was spreading. Hitchhiking plummeted, for example. But a real scarcity of physical evidence hampered the investigations. The disappearances shared striking similarities, though. Happening at night, often near construction work, often within a week of exams, victims wearing slacks or jeans, and those repeated sightings of a man with a cast or sling and a brown VW Beetle.
And then came Lake Sammamish.
Right. The Washington and Oregon murders really culminated on July 14th with 2 abductions in broad daylight from a crowded Lake Sammamish State Park. Janice Ann Ott, 23, and Denise Marie Naslund, 19, were taken by a man introducing himself as Ted. He was wearing a white tennis outfit, arm in a sling, asking for help with a sailboat for his tan VW.
In front of everyone.
Essentially, yes. Bundy later told Michaud and FBI agent William Hagmeyer that Ott was still alive when he returned with Naslund, and he actually forced one to watch as he assaulted and murdered the other. He later denied this, but that initial statement points to an extreme level of sadism, a deep enjoyment of power and control over his victims, right up to their last moments. It marked a significant escalation in the psychological torture he inflicted.
And despite multiple witnesses describing him and the car, he still wasn't caught. What happened with the tips, especially those from people close to him, like Ann Rule or his girlfriend?
King County Police, now armed with really detailed descriptions from the Lake Sammamish witnesses, they posted flyers and distributed a composite sketch. And crucially, Elizabeth Klupfer, his long-term girlfriend, Ann Rule, and a few others recognized the profile, the sketch, the car.
They call it in.
They reported Bundy as a possible suspect. But you have to remember, detectives were receiving hundreds of tips daily. They essentially dismissed the idea that this clean-cut law student with no adult criminal record could possibly be the perpetrator. This initial dismissal, maybe fueled by profiling biases or just the sheer volume of information, allowed him to continue his spree unchecked for crucial months.
And the bodies kept turning up.
Yes. On September 6th, Ott and Naslund's remains were found near Lake Sammamish, along with an extra femur and vertebrae later identified by Bundy himself as belonging to Jorgen Hawkins. 6 months later, the skulls and mandibles of Healy, Rancourt, Parks, and Ball were found on Taylor Mountain, a place Bundy frequently hiked. This just reinforced the interconnectedness of these crimes and chillingly showed his need to control the victim even after death, turning local beauty spots into these macabre dump sites.
So he leaves the Pacific Northwest, probably thinking he's putting distance between himself and the investigations, but the horror doesn't stop. He heads east to Utah. Did his methods change or escalate there, or was it just a continuation of his previous patterns?
Well, his move to Salt Lake City in August 1974 to attend the University of Utah Law School was meant to be a new chapter, a fresh start. But interestingly, he found law school completely incomprehensible. He said it was a great disappointment because he discovered other students had an intellectual capacity he felt he did not, which must have directly challenged his narcissistic self-image. And while he called Klupp for often, he quickly started dating at least a dozen other women, continuing his pattern of deception and emotional manipulation.
And the killing started again almost immediately.
Almost immediately, a new string of homicides began the very next month. He confessed later to raping and strangling an unidentified hitchhiker in Idaho on September 2nd, then returning the next day to photograph and dismember the corpse. This detail about photography highlights a deepening, more perverse need for possession and trophies, something more permanent than just the act itself.
And then in Utah itself.
On October 2nd, he abducted 16-year-old Nancy Wilcox in Holiday, Utah, apparently keeping her in his apartment for 24 hours. Her body was never found. This was a significant shift. He was now bringing victims back to his residence rather than solely disposing of them at remote sites.
He was bringing victims back to his apartment. That's a truly significant and, frankly, dangerous shift from remote dump sites. What does that tell us about his evolving pathology?
It is a critical escalation, absolutely.
Yeah.
He later explained that in Utah, he could bring his victims back to his apartment where he could reenact scenarios depicted on the covers of detective magazines.
Oh, God.
Yeah, it points to this chilling intersection of his dark fantasies and his reality, demonstrating a desire for prolonged control and a much more elaborate ritual. Melissa Ann Smith, 17, the daughter of a police chief, disappeared October 18th. Her nude body was found 9 days later. Laura Ann Aim, 17, disappeared October 31st. Her nude body found on Thanksgiving Day. Both were beaten, raped, sodomized, and strangled with nylon stockings.
And the post-mortem rituals.
Years later, Bundy described his post-mortem rituals with their corpses, including shampooing their hair and applying makeup, chillingly stating, "If you've got time, they can be anything you want them to be." It just reveals his ultimate desire for control, even over the deceased, turning them into objects for his perverse desires.
And then there was Carol Daronch, the 18-year-old telephone operator who managed to escape. This must have been a huge missed opportunity for law enforcement at the time. How did she get away?
Right. On November 8th, Bundy approached Daronch at a shopping mall, identified himself as Officer Roseland, claimed he was investigating a car break-in. He lured her into his car, but in a moment of struggle, he inadvertently fastened both handcuffs to the same wrist.
Lucky mistake for her.
Incredibly lucky. Daronch, showing incredible courage, managed to open the car door and escape. This was a critical failure on Bundy's part, a rare moment where his meticulous planning faltered, and just a testament to Daronch's will to survive.
And that connected to another disappearance.
Yes. Later that same evening, Debra Jean Kent, 17, disappeared from a high school play in Bountiful. A key found outside the auditorium unlocked the handcuffs removed from Daronch's wrist, connecting the two events directly. Bundy later admitted abducting Kent and keeping her at his apartment for a day, stating she was alive during half of it. Her patella was positively identified by DNA in 2015, linking her to Bundy conclusively.
It sounds like the police were getting closer, even if they hadn't fully linked him yet. Was Elizabeth Klupfer still trying to alert them?
They were definitely getting closer. Elizabeth Klupfer is still his girlfriend back in Seattle. She called King County Police a second time after reading about the disappearances in Utah. Then she called the Salt Lake County Sheriff's Office directly. Bundy's name was finally added to their suspect list, but without credible forensic evidence directly linking him to the murders, he wasn't immediately arrested, which is just a testament to his elusive nature and, the limitations of interagency communication back then.
He then moves on to Colorado and Idaho, expanding his hunting grounds even further. What happened there, and what new horrors did he inflict?
Well, in 1975, he shifted his criminal activity eastward again. Karen Eileen Campbell, 23, a nurse, disappeared from a hotel hallway in Snowmass Village, Colorado on January 12th. Her body was found a month later with distinctive skull fractures and deep cuts, very indicative of his blunt force trauma methods.
Huh.
Julie Lyle Cunningham, 26, a ski instructor, disappeared March 15th. Bundy later confessed to luring her using crutches as a prop, clubbing and handcuffing her, and sexually assaulting her. He then made the 6-hour drive from Salt Lake City just to revisit her remains weeks later, another chilling demonstration of his escalating post-mortem rituals.
Just keeps getting worse.
Denise Lynn Oliverson, 24, disappeared April 6th while cycling in Grand Junction. Her bike and sandals were found. Bundy admitted dumping her body in the Colorado River, an admission supported by gas receipts placing him in the area at the time. Then, on May 6th, Lynette Dawn Culver, just 12 years old, was abducted from her junior high school in Pocatello, Idaho. 12. Bundy raped and drowned her in his Holiday Inn hotel room, then disposed of her body in the Snake River. He reportedly provided intimate details about her personal life in his confession, showing the extreme youth of some of his victims and his perverse, detailed knowledge of them. Susan Curtis, 15, vanished from Brigham Young University on June 28th. She became his last confession, taped just moments before his execution. By this point, it seems serial killing had become his hobby and vocation, something he felt he was good at and, crucially, getting away with.
So how did they finally close in on him? It really seems like he was operating almost unchecked across multiple states, like a ghost moving through different jurisdictions.
It's a great question, and it really speaks to the limitations of policing back then. Before widespread computer databases and easy information sharing, what ultimately proved groundbreaking was the investigative work happening back in Washington state. Detectives there were compiling a database using what was then a huge primitive machine, basically, the King County payroll computer.
Wow, old school data analysis.
Very old school. They cross-referenced thousands of names and lists, people named Ted, owners of UWs, people associated with the victims, various sightings looking for coincidences. Out of thousands of potential leads, only 26 names appeared on 4 different lists.
And one of them was?
One of them was Bundy. He was, as one detective put it, literally at the top of the pile when word finally came from Utah of his arrest. This early, innovative use of data analysis, though rudimentary by today's standards, was absolutely crucial in finally starting to connect the widespread dots of his terror and reveal the patterns that a single, isolated investigation just couldn't see.
Danette finally closes in on for the first time. Tell us about his initial arrest in Utah and what crucial evidence they uncovered in his car. That VW Beetle seems almost iconic now.
Right. On August 16, 1975, Bundy was arrested by Utah Highway Patrol Officer Bob Hayward in Granger, a suburb of Salt Lake. Hayward observed Bundy cruising a residential area in his Volkswagen Beetle during the pre-dawn hours, which was suspicious. When Hayward initiated a stop, Bundy fled at high speed, immediately raising red flags. Hayward also noticed that the Volkswagen's front passenger seat had been removed, which he later testified seemed very unusual.
What did they find inside?
A subsequent search of the car revealed this chilling array of items: a ski mask, second mask fashioned from pantyhose, a crowbar, handcuffs, trash bags, a coil of rope, and an ice pick. Bundy, ever the manipulator, trying to explain these away as common household items or skiing equipment, but his explanations were flimsy at best.
And the connection was made.
Crucially, Detective Jerry Thompson remembered the Duranch kidnapping and Bundy's name from Elizabeth Klopfer's earlier calls, finally connecting those dots. A later search of Bundy's apartment found a guide to Colorado ski resorts with the Wildwood Inn checked where Karen Campbell disappeared and a brochure for the Viewmont High School play where Deborah Kent disappeared. Bundy later chillingly claimed searchers missed a hidden collection of Polaroid photos of his victims, which he said he destroyed after he was released on bail, highlighting his desperate attempts to erase evidence.
What did his long-term girlfriend, Elizabeth Klopfer, tell police at this point? Her testimony must have been damning, finally revealing the secret life he led behind her back.
Her testimony was absolutely pivotal, yes. Elizabeth told detectives she had found deeply unsettling objects in her house and Bundy's apartment over the years, items that just didn't fit with his public persona. These included crutches, a bag of plaster of Paris, which he later admitted stealing from a medical supply house, a meat cleaver that was never used for cooking, surgical gloves, an oriental knife she'd seen in his glove box, and a sack full of women's clothing she didn't recognize.
So she suspected things weren't right.
She suspected he stole most of his valuables, like electronics, and she recounted his chilling warning, "If you tell anyone, I'll break your fucking neck," when she confronted him about a new TV and stereo. That's a clear sign of his underlying violence and control.
And the hair.
She also mentioned he became very upset if she even considered cutting her hair, which was long and parted in the middle, just like many of his victims. Even more chillingly, she described sometimes waking up in the middle of the night to find him under the covers with a flashlight, examining her body. It reveals his deep desire for control and obsession with a specific victim profile. Sources indicate that the time it took him to need another killing was getting shorter and shorter, suggesting his control over his impulses was diminishing even as his public facade remained intact.
So with all this mounting evidence, what finally led to his charge and conviction in Utah?
Well, the forensic evidence began to pile up significantly. In September, Bundy sold his VW Beetle, but Utah police immediately impounded it. FBI technicians meticulously dismantled and searched it. Hairs were discovered matching samples recovered from Karen Campbell's body in Colorado. Later, they also identified hair strands microscopically indistinguishable from those of Melissa Smith and Carol DeRonch in Utah.
3 different victims, 1 car.
Exactly. An FBI lab specialist called that coincidence mind-boggling, a statistical anomaly that was just impossible to ignore. Then, on October 2nd, in a police lineup, Carol DeRonch immediately and unequivocally identified Bundy as Officer Roseland, the man who abducted her. Witnesses from the Bountiful High School play also recognized him. Though the evidence wasn't quite enough for murder charges at that point, he was charged with aggravated kidnapping and attempted criminal assault in the DeRonch case.
And he was convicted.
In February 1976, Bundy waived his right to a jury, likely due to all the negative publicity, and was found guilty by Judge Stuart Hansen, Jr. He was sentenced to 1 to 15 years in prison. This was really where he took his eye off the ball, as one investigator put it, making crucial mistakes that allowed law enforcement to finally catch up.
But this wasn't the end of the story, was it? In true Bundy fashion, he escaped. Not once, but twice. How on earth did he manage such audacious feats?
Not by a long shot. These escapes truly highlight his immense arrogance, his manipulative intelligence, and frankly, some serious flaws in the correctional system at the time.
Tell us about the first escape.
Okay, his first escape happened on June 7, 1977. He was at a preliminary hearing in Aspen, Colorado for the Karen Campbell murder. He was acting as his own attorney, which meant he wasn't shackled like a typical defendant.
Loophole.
Exactly. During a recess, he asked to visit the law library. While shielded from the guard's view by a bookcase, he opened a window and just jumped from the 2nd story, injuring his ankle in the fall. He limped through Aspen, broke into a hunting cabin, stole food and a rifle, and later stole a car. He was recaptured 6 days later by 2 police officers who noticed his stolen car weaving erratically down the road. They found maps of the mountain area around Aspen, indicating his escape had been meticulously planned.
Unbelievable. And the second escape?
His second escape was even more elaborate. It happened on December 30th, 1977. Back in jail in Glenwood Springs, Colorado, he somehow acquired a hacksaw blade, possibly smuggled in, and $500 in cash, smuggled in by visitors, notably Carol Ann Boone, a former coworker who was romantically involved with him and fiercely believed in his innocence.
So he had help.
It seems so. He sawed a hole in his cell ceiling over several nights, losing a staggering 35 pounds to fit through the narrow crawl space. He then broke into the chief jailer's apartment, which was in the same building but empty because the jailer was out for the holidays. Bundy changed into the jailer's clothes and calmly walked out the front door.
Just walked out.
He had a 17-hour head start before anyone even noticed he was gone. He took a bus to Denver, then flew to Chicago. This was a sophisticated, audacious plan, a real example of his increasingly wild and foolish perpetration of crimes as his control over his impulses diminished, fueled by this growing sense of invincibility.
He's a fugitive again, and this time he ends up in Florida, where he would commit some of his most brutal and infamous crimes. What did he do there? This is the Chi Omega part of the story, isn't it?
Yes. From Chicago, he traveled to Michigan, stole a car, drove to Atlanta, and finally arrived in Tallahassee, Florida on January 8, 1978. He tried desperately to find legitimate work but couldn't get anywhere without identification, so he quickly reverted to shoplifting and stealing credit cards just to survive. He suspected police were closing in, which, rather than deterring him, seemed to spur him on to this desperate final rampage.
And it happened fast.
Just a week after arriving. On January 15, 1978, he broke into the Florida State University Chi Omega sorority house through a faulty rear door. In less than 15 minutes, starting around 2:45 a.m., he launched what investigators called a blistering attack on 4 women sleeping inside.
It was brutal.
Horrifically so. Margaret Elizabeth Bowman, 21, was bludgeoned with a piece of firewood and strangled with a nylon stocking. She died. Lisa Janet Levy, 20, was beaten unconscious, strangled, had one nipple nearly torn off, was bitten deeply on her left buttock, and sexually assaulted with a hair mist bottle. She also died. Sources emphasize the sheer brutality. He beats people, he knocks people's teeth out, he bites the buttock of one of the victims.
But 2 survived.
Miraculously, yes. Kathy Kleiner, 21, and Karen Chandler, 21, were severely beaten, suffering broken jaws, terrible lacerations, and concussions. They survived, which Kathy Kleiner later attributed to car headlights flashing through the window, possibly scaring him off. A random interruption might have saved their lives.
And he wasn't done that night.
No. After leaving Chiromega, Bundy wasn't done. Later that same morning, he broke into a basement apartment just 8 blocks away. He savagely beat Cheryl Thomas, 21, dislocating her shoulder and fracturing her jaw and skull in 5 places. She survived, but was left permanently deaf in one ear and with equilibrium damage, which tragically ended her promising dance career. Police found a semen stain and a pantyhose mask with hairs similar to Bundy's at that scene.
And incredibly, he continued to kill even after those horrific attacks, didn't he? It seems his need for violence was just insatiable at this point.
Yes, his spree continued, even as the manhunt intensified. On February 8th, he drove east to Jacksonville. There, he tried to lure a 14-year-old girl, Leslie Parmenter, posing as Richard Burton Fire Department. But she was vigilant, and he was thwarted.
And then Kimberly Leach.
The very next morning, February 9th, in Lake City, 12-year-old Kimberly Diane Leach was abducted from her junior high school. 7 weeks later, her partially mummified remains were found in a remote hog shed. Her throat had been cut, and her body was horribly mutilated. Bundy was the last person seen leading her towards a white van he'd stolen.
12 years old.
12. The sources remind us that 2 of his confirmed victims were just 12 years old, making his brutality even more shocking and highlighting his escalating targeting of younger, more vulnerable victims. At this point, serial killing wasn't just a compulsion for him. It had become his hobby and vocation, as he put it, something he felt he was increasingly good at and was, for the moment, getting away with.
So, after this final, terrifying rampage across Florida, how did his run finally come to an end? How was he caught?
Well, on February 12th, running out of cash and suspecting police were closing in, he stole another car, a VW Beetle this time, ironically, and fled west across the Florida Panhandle. 3 days later, very early in the morning, around 1 a.m. on February 15th, he was stopped by Pensacola police officer David Lee near the Alabama state line. The reason? The VW Beetle had been flagged as stolen.
Just a routine stop almost.
Almost. When Officer Lee told him he was under arrest, Bundy, in a desperate final act of defiance, kicked Lee's legs out from under him and ran. There was a struggle. Bundy apparently tried to get Lee's gun before Lee finally subdued him.
In the car.
In the car, they found 3 sets of IDs belonging to female FSU students, 21 stolen credit cards, and a stolen television, clear evidence of his recent criminal activity. He was taken to the Leon County Jail in Pensacola. Officer Lee, interestingly, had no idea he had just arrested one of the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives. He just knew he'd caught a car thief who resisted arrest. Lee later reported hearing Bundy say, "I wish you had killed me," a chilling statement that perhaps reflected his desire to avoid the inevitable consequences.
After years on the run and multiple murders across several states, Bundy finally faced justice. But even in the courtroom, he seemed to be orchestrating his own twisted drama, manipulating the proceedings right to the end.
Oh, his trials were absolutely a spectacle, almost a performance piece for him. In May 1978, a Florida grand jury indicted him for the Chiromega killings and assaults. His trial began in June 1979 in Miami, and it was famously the first trial to be televised nationally in the U.S. There were 250 reporters there. It was a complete media circus.
And he represented himself, partly.
Yeah, despite having 5 court-appointed attorneys, Bundy insisted on handling much of his own defense. But as his lawyer, Polly Nelson, later noted, he consistently sabotaged the entire defense effort out of spite, distrust, and grandiose delusion. All that truly mattered to him was that he be in charge.
Even if it hurt his case.
Completely. He was arrogant in court, often smiling, even seemed to be flirting with women in the audience. He was basically pretending to be his own lawyer, despite having bombed out of law school and possessing very little actual legal expertise.
He was offered a plea deal, though, wasn't he? A way to avoid the death penalty. Why on earth would he turn that down? That seems like an irrational decision for anyone facing capital murder charges.
It does seem irrational to an outsider, doesn't it? But it speaks volumes about his profound narcissism and his desperate need for control. A pre-trial plea bargain was negotiated. He would plead guilty to killing Lisa Levy, Margaret Bowman, and Kimberly Leach in exchange for a firm 75-year prison sentence, which would have taken the death penalty off the table.
Why refuse?
Well, Bundy apparently saw this not just as a way to avoid death, but as a tactical move, a strategy. He believed he could plead guilty, wait for evidence to maybe disintegrate, and witnesses to die off or forget details, then file a post-conviction motion years later to secure an acquittal.
That's quite a gamble.
A huge gamble, but ultimately, at the last minute, he refused the deal. According to one member of his defense team, he just couldn't do it. He couldn't stand in front of the world and actually say the words, "I am guilty." This just highlights his profound narcissism and inability to admit fault. His ego and the arrogance, as the lawyer put it, got in the way of what was a perfectly rational decision from a purely legal standpoint. He simply could not surrender his perceived innocence or control of his own narrative, even if it meant risking his life.
So with his courtroom theatrics and refusal to plead guilty, what was the key evidence that finally brought him down in that Florida trial?
Well, crucial testimony came from Chi Omega sorority members like Nina Neary, who bravely identified him. She saw him leaving the house that night, clutching the murder weapon, the piece of firewood.
But the physical evidence.
The most incriminating physical evidence, the truly undeniable proof, were the bite marks Bundy had inflicted on Lisa Levy's left buttock. Forensic odontologists, Dr. Richard Sauvierne and Dr. Lowell Levine, meticulously matched these unique double bite marks to castings made from Bundy's teeth.
How did they get those castings?
Sheriff Ken Katsaris, who oversaw Bundy's incarceration, recognized the immense significance of these bite marks early on and innovatively obtained a search warrant specifically for Bundy's mouth. They went to extraordinary lengths to get clear impressions, even trying different fruits initially, and eventually developed a custom device, the Bundy brace, to immobilize his head and jaw at the dentist's office to get perfect molds.
Wow.
It was a true eureka moment for the investigators. Providing his definitive signature evidence showed he bit down, pulled away, and then bit down again in almost the same spot. On July 24, 1979, the jury, presented with this irrefutable, highly unusual evidence, deliberated for less than 7 hours before convicting him of the Bowman and Levy murders, 3 counts of attempted first-degree murder, and 2 counts of burglary. That led to 2 death sentences.
And then there was the Kimberly Leach trial, where he did something truly bizarre in court, perhaps one of the strangest moments in his already sensational story. What happened there?
Yeah. 6 months later, at the Leach trial down in Orlando, Bundy was again found guilty. This time it was largely due to compelling eyewitness testimony from a 13-year-old boy who saw him leading Kimberly Leach from the schoolyard to a stolen white van, and also crucial clothing fragments found in that van that matched Leach's clothing and Bundy's jacket, a jacket which, interestingly, had an unusual manufacturing error making the match stronger.
Okay, but the bizarre part.
Right. During the penalty phase of that trial, Bundy took advantage of an obscure, archaic Florida law that apparently allowed a marriage declaration made in open court to be considered legal. While he was questioning Carol Ann Boone, who was there acting as a character witness for him, still proclaiming his innocence, he suddenly, incredibly asked her to marry him, right there on the witness stand. She accepted, and they were declared legally married right there in the courtroom in front of the judge and jury, deciding whether he should live or die.
That is wild.
It's absolutely bizarre. Boone, remember, was deeply convinced of his innocence. She had moved to Florida to be near him, and later she actually gave birth to their daughter, Rose, in October 1981, despite conjugal visits not being officially allowed in Florida State Prison at the time. Though inmates were known to bribe guards for private time, this whole episode just highlights the powerful, almost intoxicating effect he had on some women, even while he was on death row, and his continued need for control and the appearance, however warped, of normalcy.
So he's on death row, out of legal options, appeals running out, and this is when he finally starts talking about his crimes, isn't it?
Yeah.
What did he reveal about his true motives and thought processes in those final years?
Yes, exactly. As his appeals dwindled, he began giving extensive interviews, notably to authors Stephen Michaud and Hugh Ainsworth for their book, The Only Living Witness. He often spoke in the third person, referring to the killer as the entity or just someone like him, as a way to avoid the stigma of confession, maintaining this kind of psychological distance from his horrific acts.
But he gave details.
He slowly divulged details of his crimes and, maybe more importantly, his twisted thought processes. He confirmed Elizabeth Klopfer's suspicions about his constant thievery, stating, "The big payoff for him was actually possessing whatever it was I had stolen." This desire for possession, this core need, frighteningly extended from objects to his human victims.
How did he explain the violence?
He stated that sexual assault fulfilled his need to totally possess his victims. Initially, he claimed he killed mainly for expediency, simply to avoid capture. But later, he admitted, murder became part of the adventure. The ultimate possession, he chillingly said, was the taking of the life, and then, significantly, the physical possession of the remains.
This is horrifying.
He told FBI Special Agent William Hagmeyer, who interviewed him extensively before his execution, that murder became not just a crime of lust or violence, but purely possession, They are part of you, he said, and the grounds where you kill them and leave them become sacred to you.
And the necrophilia.
He confessed to revisiting his secondary crime scenes multiple times for acts of necrophilia and also grooming and dressing the cadavers. He admitted applying makeup to Melissa Smith's lifeless face and washing Laura Ames' hair, chillingly stating that line, "If you've got time, they can be anything you want them to be." He also confessed to decapitating approximately 12 of his victims with a hacksaw and keeping at least one group of severed heads in his apartment for a period of time.
Oh my God.
Possession, control, trophies. He took Polaroid photos of his victims too. As he put it, when you work hard to do something right, you don't want to forget it. In these confessions, he also tried to rationalize it, claiming he needed to be extremely drunk to diminish his inhibitions and allow his inner entity to act another attempt to externalize blame and disown his own actions.
As his execution date rapidly approached, he tried one final desperate manipulation, didn't he? What was this bones for time scheme, and what about his sudden focus on pornography as the supposed root of all his crimes?
Right. As all his appeals ran out, Bundy tried to leverage the one thing he still had his knowledge of unsolved murders for yet another delay. He contacted Detective Keppel back in Washington, offering his expertise in serial killer psychology for the ongoing Green River killer hunt, which was a huge, terrifying, unsolved case at the time.
Trying to seem useful.
Exactly. He began offering investigators these piecemeal bits of information about his own murders, deliberately vague and incomplete, hoping to parlay the incomplete information into yet another stay of execution. He admitted, for instance, there are other buried remains in Colorado, but refused to elaborate further unless they delayed things. This strategy was immediately dubbed Ted's bones for time scheme by frustrated authorities and, if anything, only deepened their resolve to see justice finally served.
And the pornography claim, that came right at the end.
Literally on the eve of his execution, he granted this highly publicized videotaped interview to Dr. James Dobson, a prominent conservative Christian psychologist known for his anti-pornography stance. In it, Bundy made entirely new claims, blaming violent media and especially pornography as the roots of his crimes. He stated he constantly sought more potent, more explicit, more graphic kinds of material and claimed it sent boys down the road to being Ted Bundys.
Did anyone buy it?
Not really, no. Most biographers and researchers, including Ann Rule and the FBI agents who knew him best, concluded this was just one last manipulative attempt to shift blame. It was a calculated move, specifically catering to Dobson's known agenda, hoping to gain sympathy or maybe influence public opinion at the 11th hour. He had previously told others, including Michaud and Ainsworth, that pornography played a pretty negligible role in his development. As prosecutor George Deckel aptly wrote, the problem wasn't pornography. The problem was Bundy.
So there was no escaping the execution, despite his last-ditch efforts. What were his final moments like, and what was the public reaction to it all finally ending?
No, there was no escape. His journey through the appeals courts was actually unusually rapid for a capital murder case back then, which shows that the courts really moved him along as fast as legally possible, despite any public perception of endless delays. With all legal avenues exhausted, Bundy's remaining supporters lobbied Governor Bob Martinez for executive clemency, but the victims' families vehemently refused. Governor Martinez stated, quite pointedly, "For him to be negotiating for his life over the bodies of victims is despicable."
And Carol Ann Boone.
Carol Ann Boone, his wife, was reportedly devastated by his sudden wholesale confessions after years of defending his innocence. She divorced him while he was on death row, moved back to Washington with their daughter, Rose, and refused to take his final phone call.
Oh.
Bundy rejected his requested last meal steak and eggs, saying he wasn't hungry. He was executed in the Rayford electric chair at 7:16 a.m. EST on January 24, 1989. His last words, spoken softly to his attorney Jim Coleman and his Methodist minister Fred Lawrence, were chillingly mundane. "Jim and Fred, I'd like you to give my love to my family and friends."
Yeah, and outside the prison.
Outside the prison, it was a scene. Hundreds of people had gathered, almost like a tailgate party. They sang, danced, set off fireworks across the road from the prison, and cheered loudly as the white hearse carrying his body departed. It was a stark reflection of the public's overwhelming relief and, perhaps, a raw desire for finality and retribution after years of terror. His ashes were later scattered in the Cascade Range in Washington state, per his will, bringing a macabre end to his story in the very mountains where he had hunted so many of his victims.
Now let's turn to the how and the why. What do we learn about his modus operandi and victim profiles that allowed him to be so elusive for so long? What made him so effective as a predator?
Well, Bundy was an unusually organized and calculating criminal, that's clear. He meticulously used his knowledge of law enforcement procedures, gleaned partly from his political work and law school attempt, and his understanding of human psychology to evade capture for years. His crime scenes were geographically spread out, often across state lines, which led to many disparate, siloed investigations that made it incredibly hard to connect the dots initially.
And his methods were consistent.
His methods were typically blunt trauma followed by strangulation. These are relatively silent techniques using common items like crowbars, tire irons, or even tree branches. He actively avoided noisy firearms and the ballistic evidence they leave behind. He was described as a meticulous researcher, exploring surroundings for safe places to seize victims and dispose of bodies later. He was also unusually skilled at minimizing physical evidence. Famously, his fingerprints were never found at a confirmed crime scene, a fact he often repeated to investigators to maintain his air of innocence.
And the chameleon aspect.
Right. One really striking aspect, and a key insight into his elusiveness, was his curious chameleon-like ability to change his appearance. Police often found his photograph almost futile for identification because, as one detective said, his expression would so change his whole appearance that there were moments that you weren't even sure you were looking at the same person. He exploited this, using subtle changes in facial hair, hairstyle, sometimes wearing eyeglasses, and famously concealing a dark mole on his neck with turtlenecks or scarves.
The ruses.
And the ruses, yes. He would sometimes pretend to be an authority figure, like Officer Roseland or a firefighter, or often a person in distress with his arm in a sling or on crutches needing help. He lured victims by playing on basic human trust and empathy. It wasn't just a physical disguise, it was a profound psychological manipulation, exploiting society's willingness to help someone who appears injured or official.
So he clearly adapted his methods, but did he have a specific type of victim, or was it more random than people sometimes assume?
Well, all his confirmed victims were white females, mostly middle-class college students between the ages of, say, 15 and 25. Anne Rule, who knew him, noted that many had long, straight hair parted in the middle, strikingly similar to Diane Edwards, his first major girlfriend who rejected him. This led Rule to speculate that his animosity toward Edwards triggered his rampage and maybe shaped his victim selection.
Did Bundy agree with that?
No, Bundy himself later dismissed this direct link. He told interviewers his victims just fit the general criteria of being young and attractive, and insisted that almost everything was dissimilar. Physically, they were almost all different. He did concede, however, that youth and conventional beauty were absolutely indispensable criteria for him.
And he told Elizabeth Klopfer something interesting.
Yes, in their last conversation, he told Elizabeth Klopfer that he purposely stayed away from her when he felt the power of his sickness building in him. This suggests a chilling degree of self-awareness of his impulses, doesn't it? If not full responsibility, it indicates he knew the monster he was and could perhaps control it sometimes in specific contexts, choosing not to harm someone he had a longer relationship with.
Given the sheer horror of his actions and his seemingly normal, even charming exterior, what did the psychiatric experts ultimately conclude about his mind? How do they classify such a deeply disturbed individual?
Bundy underwent multiple psychiatric examinations over the years. Dr. Dorothy Otnow Lewis, a leading authority on violent behavior, initially considered bipolar disorder because people described his extreme mood swings. But later, she changed her impression dramatically. She even suggested the possibility of multiple personality disorder, now dissociative identity disorder, based on accounts from people who saw him seemingly turning into another unrecognizable person during certain moments. A prison official described a metamorphosis, a body and facial change, where Bundy became weird on me, almost emitting an odor as if a switch had been flipped inside him.
But the main diagnosis was psychopathy.
Yes. The overwhelming majority of evidence and the general consensus among experts who examined him or his case files pointed firmly towards antisocial personality disorder, ASPD, and more specifically psychopathy. He displayed that superficial charm and charisma, but had very little true personality underneath. He could distinguish right from wrong on an intellectual level, but it had minimal effect on his actual behavior, and he showed a complete, profound absence of guilt or remorse.
That quote about guilt.
Right. He famously said, "Guilt doesn't solve anything, really. I guess I am in the enviable position of not having to deal with guilt." It just highlights his profound emotional detachment from the consequences of his actions.
What other traits fit?
He also exhibited classic traits of narcissism, an inflated sense of self-importance, a need for admiration, along with poor judgment, high impulsivity, and incredibly manipulative behavior. He was reportedly evaluated using the hair psychopathy checklist revised, the PCLR, and scored a 39 out of a possible 40.
Which is extremely high.
Extremely high, considered a near-perfect score for psychopathy. It indicates an almost complete lack of empathy and a total disregard for social norms and the rights of others. Dr. Lewis eventually concurred with this assessment, stating, "I think Ted may have been a true psychopath without any remorse or empathy at all. Narcissistic personality disorder and malignant narcissism, which combines narcissism, antisocial behavior, sadism, and paranoia, have also been proposed as fitting classifications."
It sounds like he really believed his own delusions, too, even blaming everyone else for his actions and his inability to escape justice.
Absolutely. Bundy consistently deflected blame for his actions onto external factors. His supposedly tyrannical grandfather, his mother for the secret of his birth, the concealment of his true parentage itself, alcohol abuse, the media, police who he accused of planting evidence, society at large, television violence, and then finally pornography. He even tried to blame his victims, morbidly suggesting their vulnerability or how they dressed somehow invited abuse.
And he didn't see people noticing him.
What's truly fascinating and deeply disturbing is his profound delusion about his own invisibility. He was apparently always surprised when anyone noticed that one of his victims was missing, because he genuinely imagined America to be a place where everyone is invisible except to themselves. He was astounded when people testified that they had seen him in incriminating places because Bundy did not believe people noticed each other.
Just a complete lack of perspective.
Utterly. He famously complained, "I don't know why everyone is out to get me," showcasing an absolute inability to grasp the gravity of his actions or see them from any perspective but his own distorted one. Dr. Lewis noted, he really and truly did not have any sense of the enormity of what he had done. It highlights the powerful barriers to his guilt he constructed in his mind, allowing him to maintain his self-image as somehow wronged or misunderstood, despite the overwhelming evidence of his monstrosity.
Even with all the confessions and convictions, with all the detailed information we have, there's still so many unanswered questions about the full extent of Ted Bundy's crimes. How many victims are we really talking about? What's the true scale of his horror?
That really is the chilling reality, isn't it? Bundy confessed, formally, to 30 homicides across 7 states between 1974 and 1978 before his execution. But the true total remains unknown, and likely always will. He often made these cryptic comments in his interviews, seemingly designed to encourage speculation and maintain a perverse kind of control over his own dark legacy.
Like what kind of comments?
Well, he told Hugh Ainsworth that for every murder that was publicized, there could be one that was not. When FBI agents interviewing him proposed a figure of 36 confirmed victims based on their investigations, he reportedly responded, "Add 1 digit to that and you'll have it."
So, 136.
Oh,
Or 37.
where? Just messing with him.
Exactly. Was he hinting at 136? Or maybe just adding 1 to make 37? Or was he just playing games, creating more mystery? His own lawyer, John Henry Brown, who represented him early on, claimed Bundy told him in confidence that he killed over 100 people. Brown also claimed Bundy confessed his first victim was actually a young boy when they were playing some kind of sex game in the woods when Bundy was only 12, 13, 14. If that's true, it would drastically alter the understanding of his earliest pathology.
Did others believe the numbers were higher? Sheriff Ken Katsaris, who dealt with him extensively in Florida, recalled Bundy saying something like, "When you find the person that committed these crimes that you think I committed, that person is going to be wanted for murders of women in the 3 digits in 6 states. Even Reverend Fred Lawrence, the minister who administered Bundy's last rites, believed, I don't think even he knew how many he killed or why he killed them." This lingering uncertainty casts this vast, dark shadow over countless unsolved cases from that era.
What are some of the notable unconfirmed cases that still haunt investigators? Cases where Bundy remains a strong suspect, or which might point to a disturbing earlier start to his crimes than officially documented?
Oh, there are many, and they often highlight the immense challenges of cold cases, especially from that pre-DNA era. Anne Marie Burr. She was just 8 years old, disappeared from her Tacoma home in 1961. This case is particularly disturbing because Bundy, then 14, lived nearby and delivered newspapers on her route. Her father claimed to have seen Bundy hanging around a construction site near their home around that time. This case fits Bundy's own criteria for murders. He claimed he would never talk about those too close to home, too close to family, or involving victims who were very young. Despite renewed efforts, DNA analysis in 2011 yielded insufficient intact DNA for comparison. It remains unsolved.
And others from before his known spree.
Yes, Lisa Wick and Lonnie Ree Trumbull. both 20, flight attendants bludgeoned in their Seattle basement apartment in 1966. The method of blunt force trauma shows striking similarities to the Chi Omega attacks years later. Wick, who survived but suffered permanent memory loss, later told Ann Roll, "I know that it was Ted Bundy who did that to us, though she couldn't definitively prove it." Susan Marguerite Davis and Elizabeth Potter Perry. Both 19, students stabbed to death near Ocean City, New Jersey in 1969. Bundy was attending Temple University in Philadelphia nearby at that time. He later vaguely told a forensic psychologist his first victims were 2 women in the Philadelphia area. An investigator also suggested Bundy might have used his feigned injury ruse then, as his aunt claimed he was wearing a leg cast during that period.
So potentially much earlier victims.
Potentially. And then there's the case of Rita Patricia Curran, 24, strangled, bludgeoned, and raped in her Burlington, Vermont apartment in 1971. The location was right near Bundy's birthplace, and he hinted cryptically about a murder there in 1971. This case really illustrates the lasting shadow he cast. For decades, he was a prime suspect. But just recently, in 2023, DNA analysis finally identified her next-door neighbor as the killer, definitively ruling out Bundy. It's a stark example, though, of how he remained a strong suspect in unsolved cases for decades simply due to his known patterns and proximity.
And there was another survivor.
Yes, Rhonda Stapley, 21, a University of Utah student who survived an alleged attack by Bundy in Salt Lake City in October 1974, shortly after Carol Darrench escaped. She came forward decades later. She describes Bundy pulling over in his VW Beetle, offering her a ride, driving to an isolated canyon, and chillingly saying, "Do you know what? I am going to kill you now," before attempting to strangle and rape her. She incredibly escaped by falling backwards into a fast-moving river and being swept away. She kept her ordeal a secret for over 30 years due to intense embarrassment and her religious teachings at the time, saying she felt it was better to lose her life than her virtue. Her story adds such a powerful human dimension to the survivors and their often hidden, long-lasting trauma. These cases, whether later solved or still tragically open, just underscore the vast unknown scope of his crimes and his terrifying ability to operate undetected for so long. His complete DNA profile has since been added to the FBI's CODIS DNA database, so maybe, hopefully, it might bring some measure of closure to remaining victim families and other unsolved cases someday.
So what does this all mean for us, you, the listener? You've heard today about a figure who truly defied easy categorization. A man who built this intricate facade of normalcy and charm, even while harboring these deeply sadistic impulses and committing just unspeakable acts. It's such a chilling reminder that, as one expert noted, monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like the guy next door. It really challenges our very perception of trust, doesn't it?
It really does. And what's truly striking here, I think, is that consistent theme of control and possession that seemed to drive his crimes, evolving maybe from his early life experiences through his relationships to the horrific acts themselves, moving from material theft to the ultimate possession of life itself. The detailed evolution of his modus operandi, his calculated escapes, his attempts to manipulate absolutely everyone, even in his final moments. It paints this disturbing picture of a criminal mind unlike many others we encounter. This deep dive also really highlights the critical importance of persistent investigation, early data analysis, even primitive analysis like they did back then, and forensic science in bringing such individuals to justice, especially when they present such a deceptive, normal exterior to the world.
What stands out to you most from this deep dive? Maybe it's those early signs in his childhood that were so tragically missed or misinterpreted. The profound psychological impact of that pivotal rejection by Diane Edwards. Or just the sheer audacity of his crimes and escapes that stunned law enforcement for so long. For me, I think it's the profound psychological aspect, how someone could maintain such a convincing public persona, even working in crime prevention of all things, while committing such horrors.
Yeah.
How he fooled so many people for so long.
Yeah, and that raises an important question that continues to challenge our understanding of criminal psychology, doesn't it? Given the deeply conflicting accounts of his childhood, his own constant tendency to deflect blame, and his apparent mix of self-awareness alongside profound delusion. How much of Bundy's pathology was shaped by his early environment, by those foundational lies and alleged abuse, and how much was an inherent, perhaps unchangeable disposition? Was he born or was he made? It's a question that continues to challenge our understanding of what creates a serial killer.
A truly provocative thought to leave you with. One that encourages us, perhaps, to look beyond the surface, to question what we think we see, and understand that the depths of human behavior can be far more complex and sometimes far more disturbing than we often imagine. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.